So, what can we conclude about the relationships between political institutions and conflict? A couple of things. First, political change is dangerous. People are more likely to use violence during times in which the political rules are up for debate, after political institutions have changed, or when they're in the process of changing. Um, this institutional change can really shift people's cost benefit analysis, both the elites as well as the masses, as to um, whether it's the costs are lower for participating or the benefits are higher. There's a lot of literature on democratic change, democratic institutions, autocratic institutions in conflict. Too much to try to cover in any one day. I chose four readings that I thought were the most relevant to the larger scale of the class, and including a couple of works that were quantitative and comparative. One literature review that I think would also be useful for students who are trying to think about what they would include in their own literature reviews for this class or for other classes. And ones in which it highlights the kind of main results and the most influential results in the literature. Over the next 9 weeks, we're going to be coming back to political institutions and how they shape environmental protection regulations, human development spending, political institutions and representation, domestic and international responses to a lot of the challenges that we're going to touch on in this class. So for today, I just wanted to highlight another area of major explanations for the causes of conflict, political institutions. There are a lot of unstated and explicit assumptions about the importance of whether you need to look at the level of democratic or autocratic development in a similar way as you might want to look at economic development, as well as the speed of change of these kind of factors. Regan and Bell talked about that one of their major contributions is the fact that people would just look at how long a country has been a democracy or an autocracy, how long there has been any change, and not necessarily look at the direction and the magnitude of that change. And so Regan and Bell are talking about how the transition from democracy to anocracy is more dangerous than going the other way around, right? So you have to look at whatever factor you're looking at. Are you looking at the level of development of political institutions or other factors, or are you looking at the speed of change? Because as we saw with the Arab Spring and the years since the Tahrir Square protests, the speed of change can take on different trajectories in different places and have different overall effects for political stability. So the magnitude changes as well as the change from what level. Another main finding is this inverted U relationship between political institutions and conflict. There's little evidence of a monotonic or one directional change, either up or down, as political institutions change. It's really those countries and systems that have some characteristics of autocratic states and some democratic institutions. Those those states have some openness that allow for some pushback, but not enough for them to really give legitimacy to their government. And so those states um, are ones that are the most in flux. I think another interesting thing from the literature review from Hegre is that he critiques this larger literature on democratic institutions and conflict by basically saying that this relationship of democracy and peace, these two factors, are really determined by background existing socioeconomic conditions, which is another way of saying that there's an issue of spuriousness in which you have a third factor driving both your outcome and your causal factor. And so this is an ongoing, excuse me, an ongoing challenge with this literature is trying to choose a level. There's always things, background conditions that happen farther back in time, or maybe more aggregate factors. What level can you look at to really tease out separate relationships that you can be sure that the relationship is going in one direction and not necessarily missing something important behind that's driving both of those factors? Um, the other, I think, one of the major takeaways from this literature is that political institutions, as they consolidate, are less likely to lead to conflict. It can be institutional consolidation of an autocracy or a democracy, right? I think there's a reason why we haven't heard that much about political violence in Chechnya, in Russia, as the Putin regime has consolidated over time. A lot of other examples of political leaders that get challenged either internationally or domestically in their first years of power, but that they become consolidated and it becomes more costly or risky for others to challenge them. Though, of course, this is often non-monotonic as well. Institutional consolidation, if it's based around an individual, then individuals don't lead forever. They don't live forever. And so the transition to their designated or non-designated leader is a time of risk, because the consolidation, if it's around norms and traditions and institutions, that's less individual dependent, and so it's less a change when you have to worry about changing people. Another major factor that we've touched on here, but we're going to see over time, is that elections increase the risk of conflict. And of course, the relationship, it goes the other way. That after conflict, there often a call to hold elections in areas that haven't had elections for long periods of time. So elections are a time of flux and uncertainty, and you can never be quite sure which way things are going to go. That's why the stakes are high, and people are going to be the most likely to compete. And international actors might also want to try to get involved. Democracies that result from these kind of elections can encourage forms of negotiation and ways of avoiding conflict, increasing integration of states within international systems that allow ways of dealing with challenges both within the state and without the state that can be less likely to have conflict. It's hard to kind of also escape economics. The economics literature that we looked at last week saw both the greed and grievance motivations for leading to conflict. Democratic institutions can either channel those impulses towards working within the system or without. We're going to see in later weeks in this class the natural resources, lootable resources, other resources that come from taking control of the state or part of the state can increase the risk of conflict. And so developed states might be overall less likely to have conflict, but a part of that could be because the economy is so diverse that control of the central state might hold less opportunity for personal gain. A couple of last themes. One is the risk of endogeneity when looking at political institutions and conflict, right? We've talked so far today on looking at how democratic institutions lead to conflict, but then you could also, there's a smaller literature looking at how conflict can lead to democratic or institutional change after it's actually ended, depending on who wins, depending on the nature of the conflict, and the decisions that are made in elections afterwards. But you have to think about these causal arrows going both way and reciprocal effects between the different factors, including with political institutions. And I think another link between last week and this week is that in the Collier reading for this week and in his other work, seems to think that economic development is a sufficient condition to try to avoid conflict, but insufficient in for a political science like Howard Hegre. So when you think about specific causal mechanisms, we focus on institutions today. But others might say that they need to be in place with other conditions are in place, or that some factors are more substantively important, more important than others. And it often, your conclusions can often depend on your perspective and assumptions and field that you're actually coming from. So let's talk a little bit more about that in a second.